Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 1 to the Honourable Prime Minister. In light of the Prime Minister's recent commute on the ferry service, could the Prime Minister state his findings and recommendations, if any, that arose from his experience?
Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I trust that my colleague from Chaguanas West does not think that this commute to Tobago is an unusual action on my part. However, Madam Speaker, last Sunday I took a trip to Tobago on the Express, and among my findings is that the ferry has a built capacity for, if all 4 engines are operational, the trip to Tobago could be in the order of 3.5 hours. If perchance those 4 engines aren't operational and it's running on 3 engines, it can do the trip in 4 hours or thereabouts. And if, of course, there are only 2 engines operating, then the trip would take 5.5 hours, but the ferry can travel on 2 engines. On the day when I traveled on Sunday last, 2 engines were operational from the trip from Port of Spain to Scarborough. And that was understood before we left. So on a 2-engine driven ferry, we left Port of Spain at 4 o'clock and arrived in Tobago at 9:20. However, Madam Speaker, this was not entirely news to me because it has been known to the national community that we have been having considerable difficulty with the ferry service, largely as a result of a rash of breakdowns and indications of poor maintenance. And it came to my attention that the ferry had skipped its dry docking arrangements at an earlier time, and arrangements were not in place for the proper maintenance. But more shockingly, I discovered in conversation with the management of the port is that for the last 11 years, we had hired operators of the ferry service. And when at the end of the 11-year period, that arrangement was changed to local management, I was told by the port that one of the difficulties we are facing now with respect to these breakdowns and response to the ferry service maintenance and so on, is that the port does not have under its control or access to the maintenance record of these ferries for the last 11 years, meaning that while the port hired help to run the service, no arrangement was made to bring the maintenance data into an archive or control of the port. So now that we've made the changes, we are now in a situation where we have to literally begin to build a record of maintenance and service on the ferries. Now that is an unacceptable state of affairs, and what the government has done in the face of the difficulties we are undergoing now, particularly people of Tobago, is that we have had to go back now to the manufacturers to send technical people to us with these ferries as we make arrangements to put the 2 ferries on dry docking, which is long overdue. I've read a report which has shown a series of operational difficulties with the ferry, some of them quite serious with respect to the steering gear and the introduction of water into the system that shouldn't be there and so on. The bottom line is that our 2 ferries, the Express and the Spirit, require urgent and extensive overhaul, and against that background, the government has taken steps to authorize the port to find an interim vessel, which they are working on, and the port will speak on that in the future. But there's, in answer to the question further, as to what is being contemplated, it is clear to me that the relevant information that is required for proper operation of the port and some of the systems in the port, including management and other kinds of systems, require serious overhaul, and there's some significant difficulty in getting the relevant information in the port. And as a result of that, I am contemplating asking the Minister of Transport to put into the port an investigative team to understand exactly what is going on in the port with respect to the ferry service, and in keeping with the intention to have the THA and Tobagonians involved in it, we will review the whole operation of the ferry service, and that I will say further, the Minister of Works will announce in due course what action will be taken with respect to understanding the details of the problems that plague the port.
Might I, before I call on the next supplementary, might I just recommend that we try to keep response to 2 minutes in order for us to see how we deal with the people. Member for Tabuikit.
Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, I'm very happy to hear that you are going to put an investigative team to look at the history of what has happened to the ferry service. But at the same time, I would like to ask the port, okay, but I want to focus on the ferry service in this instance. Was anyone at all in the port identified as having the responsibility to directly oversee over these years the elements of the contract with Bay Ferries? And if so, are you going to ask the port to take disciplinary action at the level it ought to be taken with respect to the what I consider not proper supervision of this particular contract, the details of which would be well known?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, that question is embodied in the assignment of the new board of the port, which is looking at that and similar matters.
For Puchis.
Madam Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, are you satisfied that going back to the manufacturer, the builder of these vessels is the best course of action, as opposed to retaining a new or another maintenance contractor that can be available on a regular basis to supervise the maintenance of these vessels?
Yes, sir.
Under the situation that exists now, we are satisfied that having the manufacturer involved in guiding us as to what the real problem is the best course of action, because we are of the view that there is a question mark being raised with respect to the ability to maintain the services and what is required to be in place to ensure that proper maintenance is in action.
And finally, could I ask the report that the Prime Minister says he received on the 11-year-old problem with these vessels of not having kept the records? Is this a report that you received in writing or orally?
I received no report in writing. I said in conversation with the management on Sunday afternoon.
Member for Carinese.
Honourable Prime Minister, in the government's decision to move forward in alleviating this problem, searching for new vessels to do the work, how far have you reached in that, and when can the people expect some alleviation of their difficulties?
I would ask the member to pay attention to the statements by the minister responsible for this activity, which is the Minister of Transport, who has indicated on more than one occasion that the actions of the ministry and the port working together to bring some relief to the Tobagonians in particular in the shortest order is that we expect that an interim arrangement with a different vessel would be in place for the ferry service by the end of this month.
Member for Carinese.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could the Honourable Prime Minister indicate whether the probe, as promised by the Attorney General, into allegations of mismanagement, corruption and bid rigging into the Educational Facilities Company Limited has been completed? If so, when would its findings be made available to the Parliament?
Madam Speaker, when we came into government in September 2015, one of the first difficulties we encountered was the whole rash of allegations and claims and actions of misconduct at this particular company, as a result of which I, as Prime Minister, had to ask the Attorney General to look at what was going on in EFCL as we appointed a board. After a year of this board wrangling with those problems, we have had to appoint a new board, elements of a new board. And at the moment, the Central Audit Committee is from the Ministry of Finance. Corporation Seoul is conducting an investigation into the total operations of this company. And when that is concluded, I'll be in a better position to respond to the concerns of the honourable member.
Member for Carneys.
Is there any particular reason why, as Prime Minister, who has the responsibility overall, have decided to keep 2 or 3 of the former board directors? What's the reason?
There's very good reason, Madam Speaker, because we had, in seeking to grapple with the issues surrounding this company, we had appointed some new members to the board in February. And with the chairman resigning in May or June, we were then required to reconstruct the board. And because these 3 persons had only just gone on there and would have been not exposed to anything before, we felt it was necessary to, or it was okay to keep them because they had only just joined the board in February.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, is there a foreign forensic team assisting the central audit in the investigation on this matter?
Not at this time, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Prime Minister, in the context of you said the findings will be made available. And if there are no findings now, how is it that you made the decision to terminate 3 directors and leave 3?
Madam Speaker, I am not aware that we've terminated directors. We had some resignations and the board had to be reconstituted. So we've left the 3 new members who had not resigned, who had just been appointed. And where we had vacancies created by resignation, we have strengthened the board, and in fact, we are in the process of completing the appointments to that board.
Member for Carney East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could the Prime Minister state what measures he intends to implement to address the problems being experienced by patients in the healthcare system? It's a broad thing, but I can ask you supplementals on it.
Madam Speaker, all healthcare systems across the world are continuously plagued by problems. Trinidad and Tobago is no different. We acknowledge that there are a series of problems, and those problems could be related to infrastructure, to financing of operations, supply of medicine, supply of caregivers, and so on. So we acknowledge that these are ongoing situations, and there's no day in which these problems would have been solved. So very early in the tenure of this government, and in recognition that there's a need to continuously try to do better as a government with respect to healthcare delivery, one of the things we did was to appoint a committee of experts, if you may call it that, I would just say experienced people. And this committee was required, as its mandate, to look at the whole question of healthcare delivery in Trinidad and Tobago. That committee was chaired by a very experienced doctor, Dr. Winston Welsh, and he was ably supported by Dr. Wayne Frederick, a national who is the president of Howard University, and a medical practitioner. Professor Carl Theodore, who, as you know, out of UWI is an expert in healthcare economics. Mr. Martin DeGans, Dr. Adesh Serju Singh, Mrs. Valerie Allen Rawlins, and Dr. Albert Prasad. This team was assigned the responsibility of looking at the healthcare system in Trinidad and Tobago with a view to identifying its problems and making recommendations to solving these problems as identified. As you would have been aware, Madam Speaker, this committee submitted its report a few months ago. The report came to there are 2 separate reports, yes. There was a first one and a second one, which both together now form the basis for a series of consultations which are currently underway, led by the Ministry of Health, and the report itself has been laid in the Parliament. and is before a select committee of the House.
Member for Carinese.
Bearing in mind that the work that has to go on further in the deliberations of the recommendations of this committee, Honourable Prime Minister, would you acknowledge that this will take some time to go still to begin to implement some of the recommendations when it has to go through the JSA and so on? But what urgent measures are you going to take to alleviate the situations of chronic drug shortage, no instrument and equipment for surgical operations, the delay in surgical operation time, etc.? It needs urgent attention. Could you give us some elucidation on this?
The Ministry of Health, under the guidance of the Minister of Health, are addressing those issues on a daily and ongoing basis.
Member for Oropouche West.
Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister, in relation to the recent transfer of the Permanent Secretary and Communications Officer of the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs, could the Prime Minister indicate if any further action will be taken in this ministry to curtail mismanagement of public funds?
The government's interest in the curtailment of mismanagement with respect to public funds is an ongoing exercise, and it doesn't only apply to the Ministry of Sport. And insofar as there's a need to have any further action taken, as soon as those decisions are made, you will be advised publicly.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister, satisfied with the explanations given by the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs for the expenditure incurred at taxpayers' expense on his recent trip to Tobago?
Madam Speaker, this Prime Minister has very high standards and is very difficult to be satisfied. So it might very well be that, given the high standards I maintain and expect, that this is not the only matter that has not met my satisfaction.
Member for Princestown.
Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister. Honourable Prime Minister, with respect to your comments about having a young cabinet and needing experience and assistance in terms of management, can you indicate whether there's any formal arrangements being put in place to provide management experience in members of your cabinet?
Madam Speaker, the question of the age of ministers or the experience of ministers is not an excuse for non-performance. However, having accepted portfolio responsibilities, there's a requirement, and that requirement is being met from time to time. We will review what is being done internally, and if external help is required, that help is brought in. But cabinet responsibility, as the member may never understand, you are always exposed to learning as you go forward in the dispensing of public service at cabinet responsibility level.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In relation to this trip, could the Prime Minister advise us how many stakeholders did the Minister of Sport meet with, the site visits he conducted in Tobago, and how many awards did he hand out at the Tobago House of Assembly Sports Award?
Member, I will not allow that as a matter falls under the purview of Prime Ministerial questions. Member for Couva South.
6, Madam Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister advise as to what reforms the government is considering for the national insurance system in light of recent pronouncements by the management of the National Insurance Board that its funds will be exhausted by 2030 under the current mode of operation?
Madam Speaker, with respect to this development and this particular matter, the government would be guided by the findings and recommendations of the 9th Actuarial Review of the National Insurance System and advice from expert consultants hired for that purpose.
Member for Couva South.
Madam Speaker, is the Prime Minister in agreement with certain pronouncements in relation to this issue that if reform doesn't occur now, that the management of NIB will be forced to sell off assets of the national insurance system?
Madam Speaker, that is not a matter for me to be in agreement or disagreement with. That's a statement of fact. If the operations are to continue beyond any date of insolvency.
Member for Point of Peer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister, will the Prime Minister say whether the government has reached an agreement to divest 40% of Trinidad Generation Unlimited, TGU, to a private sector investor?
Madam Speaker, the Minister of Finance in his capacity as corporation sole is currently exploring the divestment of 40% of TGU, and there is no agreement at this time. But as was mentioned in the national budget, in order to raise capital for the development program, the Minister of Finance will take steps to divest this and other assets within the fiscal year 2017. And that work is proceeding apace, and we anticipate that it would be concluded in some time to allow some capital injection into the ongoing development program.
Member for Point of Peer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Supplementary, Prime Minister, could the Prime Minister be a bit more definite as far as the timeline for divestment of this 40%?
I thought I just did that. The timeline is within fiscal 2017. The fiscal year ends in September. And as was said in the budget, the divestment ought to take place within this year so that we could receive the money within this year to deal with the accounts of this year, fiscal year ending September 30th. And I think the Minister of Finance is working on that. If we get interested parties, proper arrangements, and we conclude the transactions, we're working towards being able to conclude those matters so that the funding of the transfer of the shares would allow the 40% worth of shares to come into the Minister of Finance's account, exchequer account, before the end of the fiscal year.
Member for Chaguanas-West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, what is the procurement process, keeping with the government commitment to transparency and value for money in acquiring this divestment partner in divestment?
The process is the widest process. We are having indicated in the national budget a public expression that we are interested in receiving from interested parties, and we prepare to divest. We are considering offers. We are inviting persons who may be interested, international companies that are working in Trinidad and Tobago in the area. We're looking at the broader spectrum, and the Cabinet will determine, based on the offers, what is the best option for the government of Trinidad and Tobago.
For Tabakit.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Prime Minister, in selling off these assets, it's easy to have all these funds utilized perhaps for recurrent expenditure. Has the Prime Minister considered whether in divesting these assets, which are capital assets, that the funds so received are placed into a special capital development fund so that they'll be used to generate medium to long-term streams of income for new capital projects rather than simply dissipating it in current expenditure?
Madam Speaker, it's very interesting that these proposals are coming now. It would have been a whole lot more useful when NGC had $16 billion in their bank account. If we had said that monies drawn down from NGC would go into a diversification program or new development projects, it's a great idea. Except that those funds were spent within the confines of all kinds of things I don't know. But right now, given the fungibility of money, where if we spend money in the health sector on medicine, we don't have it to spend on the road building program. If we spend money on the school salaries for the teachers, we don't have it to spend on tourism infrastructure. However, what we are doing as per the national budget, we are running a deficit on the basis that we will borrow money and ensure that a capital program exists which is funded well, one can identify by the money we borrow. But to say that this dollar is spent on that and that dollar is spent on that, that's not how it goes. The ability to keep the capital program going in a deficit budget can be interpreted that we are borrowing to spend on the capital program.
Member Fish-Gornas West. Member Fish-Gornas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister, I go back to the procurement process. Is this going to be where there's clear criteria, there's a valuation? What is being done in terms of the process so as to ensure we get the value for money for the significant part of our capital assets?
Yes, I want to give the member the assurance that a value done by arm's length valuators would be established for the asset of TGU, and therefore 40% of it can be easily calculated, and then whoever is partnering with the government would be required to pay at that valuation. And of course, if I go a little further, the Minister of Finance also indicated that the government would maintain majority shareholding in the company so as to be in control of its future in a certain way, and there would be a small, I think it's 10% or 9%? 9% of the shareholding of that company would be made available to in the form of a share IPO, where nationals, pension funds, unit trusts, and so on can have a shareholding. So it is the intention to sell down the asset to the point of 49%, while the state retains 51%, and that has been made clear by the Minister of Finance before. So I want to give the assurance that this is as transparent as it can get.
But for point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister, question 8. Would the Prime Minister inform this House as to the amount of dividends paid by the National Gas Company, NGC, to the Ministry of Finance for the period September 14, 2015 to April 30, 2017?
Madam Speaker, for the period 14th of the 9th, 15, that is 14th of September 2015, to 30th of April 2017, NGC advises that they've paid $3.3 billion in dividend. And that is not earnings. That includes the monies obtained by the sale of the TTNGL shares. So a significant portion of that came from the sale of those assets.
For point of order.
Madam Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Could the Prime Minister explain what these $3.3 billion was used for in the last 21 or 20 months?
Once again, Madam Speaker, I'm flabbergasted to receive a question like that from the other side. We received in the period of the last year $3.3 billion, of which the majority was for the sale of shares in TTNGL. Compare that, Madam Speaker, with $14 billion paid to the last government. And we cannot find what that $14 billion was spent on. He's coming to ask me now what we use $3.3 billion to do. We use it to close the deficit gap in the national budget.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Prime Minister, number 9, could the Prime Minister give an update on the Tobago Sandals project?
Madam Speaker, this project, the discussions between the government's team, because the government has put in place a special purpose vehicle and qualified individuals to negotiate the entry of sandals into Trinidad and Tobago. Those discussions took place in April and continued into May, and we are expecting a visit from Sandals in the very near future. And it is my expectation that the discussions could be satisfactorily concluded in the not too distant future. And as soon as such conclusions are obtained, the national public would be advised. But the discussions continue as per an orderly fashion.
Honourable members, the time for Prime Minister's question is now spent.